here just to quickly introduce Doug here. So Doug discovered Hypernomics, which studies markets in 4+ dimensions. He's published 13 papers and won ICEA awards for 4 best track papers and 1 best paper overall. His company, Hypernomics Inc., worked for NASA and Lockheed Martin. He co-holds U.S. patent 10402838 for the world's first 4D analytics software. Wiley published his book Hypernomics, just using hidden dimensions to solve unseen problems in 2024, which reached #1 in macroeconomics on Amazon in July 2024. So let's please give it up for Doug.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction, Cassidy, which I wrote. So as you can see here, the title is Safety Fourth. Some of you might recognize the picture on the left. That's Harold Lloyd in a famous film. I picked this thing for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of plays off on my title. Plus, it also happened in Los Angeles over 100 years ago. So here's Harold hanging over what I believe to be Main Street over 100 years ago. And then the picture on the right, also in LA County, is from a house up against the beach in Malibu. Now, houses in LA are a function, the price of a house in LA is a function of the size of the house, the size of the lot, and in this case, the proximity to the beach. And so maybe the fourth thing you would think of when it comes to a house would be, well, how safe is it? Well, now this gentleman right here, I know it's a gentleman because he was on TV, he built this house out of glass, concrete, and steel, and he was the last house standing for blocks. So his safety concern, which others around him didn't have, actually made it so that he was safe after the fires. So how do you get interested in something like this? Well, a long time ago, in July of '71, well before Cassidy was born, I went to the Tacoma Narrows Airport, which is a bit of a misnomer. It's actually on the Kitsap Peninsula. You have to go over the bridge to get to it. And a friend of mine and I were going to take a flight in a Cessna 172, which looks a little bit like this plane right here, which in turn looks a little bit like this plane here. And we said, hey, we're gonna have a nice little flight. So my friend had just gotten his pilot's license. We're both 16, and we're really excited. We're gonna go to Portland. We're gonna take a flight. Now, it's the largest airport in Oregon. It's got military and civilian tracks to it. Those 2 big runways parallel to the river, the main runway is there, and then we're gonna come into runway 21. And we're all fired up. We're gonna take a little trip. So it's a big adventure for a couple of high school kids. So we went flying. We headed south towards the Washington-Oregon border. Along the way, we saw Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens before it blew up, and then eventually Mount Hood. Just after we saw Mount Hood, we turned for our final approach to the airport. The landing followed, but it was more of a series of bounces. We survived and the plane did too, but my friend's ego was certainly bruised. That buzzer you heard was the stall warning horn that went off several times during the landing. So what happened was we landed, and the stall buzzer that you just heard there squealing, the stall buzzer announced that we're about to stall. A stall buzzer tells you you're going to stall within 5 or 10 knots of stalling. A stall is when the plane slows down to the point where the wings no longer develop lift and the aircraft stops flying and drops. You want that to happen when you are landing, ideally as the wheels touch the ground. You don't want that to happen 10 or more feet above the ground, or you will have what you saw in our little video. Now, it turns out that in the Cessna 172, there's a little stall warning hole up on the upper wing there, and it works by having the difference in the air pressure going across a reed, which sets off that warning that you just heard there. So we bounced on several times, but we were fine. So this event got me to thinking about safety. And specifically, since we're estimators here, how to quantify safety. So now what we're going to do here is, all of you know how to quantify the cost associated with your company. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at how the outside world sees your company with respect to safety, and what would happen if you increase the safety of your product. Well, how would the market see that? And then we're going to jam that up against how you actually make your products. So what are we going to look at here today? Well, we're going to make the hypothesis that adding safety will add cost and schedule. And then we're hypothesizing as well that the added safety may increase the value as the sustainable prices for these three categories of products we're going to look at: general aviation aircraft, airliners, and launch vehicles. So I maintain that effective programs have to balance all these parameters, many of which you're aware of. But the schedule, and you know schedule and cost, but we're going to talk about too is the price and the profit and the value all at the same time. So this presentation is offering a framework to study that kind of stuff. So in commercial programs especially, what happens is companies lay out cash. They have what's known as the cash bucket. They get down to a certain point at a bottom. They start to go into production. They start to sell their product, and the revenue starts coming in. You're starting to approach break even, and then you go past break even. So we might call this first look at what we have here as being the baseline. And so what we're talking about here is we want to see if we can add some more safety, and if that might increase the value. We want to check out how that might work if we were to do that. So we want to ask ourselves, how can we measure that? So again, we have three categories we want to check into here. So we're going to start out with general aviation. Now, all of you being good estimators, you always start with data. So first things first, you're going to go out and create yourself a database. So we went out and retrieved a bunch of models and a bunch of variables here and created ourselves a pretty thorough database. Now you'll notice here that this doesn't have any kind of just straight up safety parameter. What we're going to look at here are two different elements in the safety parameter, the safety parameters that may be of value to us. So what we did was we took all those variables and we jammed them together to form these three value equations. Now, value equation in our vernacular means what's the predicted value or price of our product based on these features. Now, I'm not going to bother you with each one of these three equations in detail, except to say that what we're trying to zoom in on are the number of engines. So the hypothesis here is that two engines are better than one when it comes to safety. If you have a two-engine plane and one engine goes out, you've got a slightly underpowered plane. If you've got a one-engine plane and the engine goes out, you got a glider. And it turns out that there's a new company, new in terms of the fact that general aviation planes have been around for a century. This newer company here has decided to put a ballistic parachute on a plane. And we're going to see if we can isolate the added value of that ballistic parachute. So we have two jobs here. We're going to try to isolate the value of the extra engine and the value of the parachute. So here in general aviation, we're going to talk about adding features. Later when we get into airliners, we're going to be looking at the ability to avoid crashes. And then when we look in launchers, we're going to look at the success rate of hitting the intended orbit with our product. So we're going to show ourselves a few options out of the dozens that are available to us here. So if you were to go through the paper, there's an equation 2 there. And what I've done here is I've taken these three equations down here, and I've populated them with options for one engine and no parachute. Now, you might find your bosses might like a kind of view like this. These are a series of sliders on the left-hand side that drive input variables that in turn drive these costs that in turn drive the bar chart here. So this is a little technique that we've employed for some time to try to show how costs change as the variables change. So again, notice that the three cuts at this one particular option all kind of zoom into the same answer. They're all in the low 400,000. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, what happened if we added one engine? So here's equation 3 now with two engines. So equation 3 is the green thing there. It's got equation 3's got two engines. Actually, equation 4 has also got two engines. So they've both gone up compared to their baseline. So this is telling you that if you add an engine, the market sees that you would get a certain return on that. So as estimators, what you would want to do is figure out the added cost of that engine, adding it, relative to the added value, and then compare that to the demand and see if you're going to be money ahead. Now, what we could also do then is, as I said here, is we could add a ballistic parachute. So equation 4 now, we've changed equation 4. We've got this two engines as we did last time. And we've added this ballistic parachute. And you see that the value of that third equation, the one in brown, has now jumped up to $728,000. Now, what's it take to put a ballistic parachute into a plane? Well, the entire industry didn't know about that. Ballistic parachutes kind of came out, if I'm understanding this correctly, came out of the ultralight and the paraglider kind of industry, because people would occasionally put ballistic parachutes on them so that when they had a problem, they could fall easily to the ground. So then Cirrus Aviation decided to put that into a general aviation plane. Now, in order to do that, what they had to do is they had to effectively put a keelson across the center of their cockpit there, their cockpit roof. They had to have enough strength in the keelson to be able to take the load of the whole plane with this parachute. And what happens here is that when people get into trouble, well, they pop their chute, and in this case, this father-daughter combination floated down to the ground safely. So you might ask yourself, well, how long does it take to retrieve the value of this added device here? And it turns out that it was a while, because Cirrus came up with this idea in the early 2000s. But several years into using this on aircraft, in fact, as late as 2011, they had a fatality rate that was higher than the industry average. You see here that they were up at 1.6, the industry average is 1.2. Well, they instituted this program to teach people how to use the parachute and when to use the parachute, how to deploy it. Because a lot of people were just popping the chute for reasons that they shouldn't have, and then they ran into trouble. And the fatality rate was actually higher than the industry average. But in a year and a half, they managed to take it down to below the industry average, and then another year and a half, further still. So now that they're at about 1/4 of what they were before, and less than half, about roughly 1/3 of what the industry average is. So it took years to gain these safety advantages, and the point would be that safety is an ongoing concern, and we always have to address ourselves to that. Now, there's been a lot of information in the news about airliner safety. Here, we're going to look at a condition that happened prior to the Boeing 737 MAX being in the market, and we're going to look at how we could quantify safety here. Now, in this case, we're not going to talk about added features. We're going to talk about crash rates and what it means if you have a crash rate that's lower than your competition. So we created this database several years ago. Didn't have the 737 MAX or the the A32X Neos in it yet. And you can see it had a lot of miles, a lot of variables. And so what we had to do is we had to exclude the vehicles that didn't have any losses to date, because it's going to be we're going to have a power form equation that's going to describe what's going on here. So as we know, power form equations don't behave too well when something goes to zero. So we took out the A380 that had no losses and worked with the remaining data. And the observation you might make is, in order to be able to quantify differences, you first have to find differences. And so how do you find a difference? Well, it works out that there's an outfit that, and I cite this in the paper, that studies what the loss rate has been by region. And so I looked at this and I go, wow, that's pretty good. Looks like North Asia and North America are pretty good, and so is the industry. But you might ask yourself, as I did, what about the Commonwealth of Independent States? You might say to yourself, what is the Commonwealth of the Independent States? Well, I found out that it's Russia and its former satellites. That's the Commonwealth of Independent States. You see here, you see that? Well, they're not doing as well as other people. Now, many of you know, at least I knew this bit, was that the Commonwealth of Independent States often runs Eastern Bloc built aircraft, which is to say the Russians like to run Russian planes. So if you can find the data for the Western built planes and can compare it to the Russian built planes, then you have the ability to weigh out the differences between these things, which is what I attempted to do. And so the next logical thing is to go out and find some starting points here. So it works out that there's some outfits that study hull losses. Now, very interestingly, they'll give you hull losses per million hours of flight, but you probably want to get hull losses per flights. So you end up having to do some work to get it to hull losses per million flights. And so there's work described in the paper that shows you how to do this. So this is a Western built plane. This is the Bombardier Q. It's called the Dash 8 now. It's now also known as the Q400. This is a fixed wing turboprop. And you can find like data for every model that's built in the United States and the Western Bloc. But what's harder to find is data on the Russian aircraft. And so the Russians don't really publicize their stuff. So you have to do a bunch of reading in between the lines, as I did here. You can pull a bunch of their data and they'll tell you how many hours they ran. And you have to go out and do various ways to work out their hours per month. So you take the number of months they ran, the hours per month, and then you figure out how many hours they flew to get the million hours, and then you start to take the losses out of that. And when you do all this kind of manipulation, which I did, you'll come up with the hull loss rate per million hours of flight. Million flights, excuse me. And this is crucially different than something you would see with the general aviation aircraft. The general aviation aircraft talk about fatalities, not just the hull loss, but fatalities per 100,000 hours. The airliners go 10x on that and are looking at hull losses. The fatalities are a smaller fraction than this. But what shows up here pretty quickly is the highest hull loss rate I could find in the industry here is for a Cessna 208B, and that's a cargo master. That's something that FedEx uses. And there's been about 3,000 of these guys that are bound here. But you see this guy in red? That's the Tupolev 204-100. Now the Tupolev 204-100 is basically a 737 Airbus 320 knockoff. Now we're going to compare it to the Boeing 737-800. This Tupolev 204-100 carries more people, goes faster, and has a longer range than the Boeing 737-800, but the Tupolev crashes on average 36 times more frequently than the Boeing plane did. And what this means then is that the Tupolev people were effectively excluding themselves from the market. So while Boeing sold, I think, something in the order of 6,000 to 8,000 versions of this particular 737, Tupolev sold about 80. It's almost 100 to 1, the difference in the quantity sold. So what you might want to do then is you might want to look at the top factors that correlate back to price. And so this is kind of where the idea of safety fourth came in here. Trying to look at the order of correlation to the price here. And basically when you're buying an airplane, you're buying a volume going at a speed over a range. Those end up being your top predictors of price. And then as you work your way down the line here, you see number of engines, which we used in the general aviation. That's a consideration. And then hull losses are down there. They end up being about a sixth order effect. You say, well, what would happen if we isolated that factor along with some of the more primary factors? What would happen then? Well, you can do that, and I did. And you get this very well correlated equation here, which says after you have this constant here times the speed to a power times the volume to a power times the loss rate. Now you notice the loss rate has got a negative exponent. That basically says more losses, lower price, or conversely, fewer losses, higher price. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it's a good idea, first of all, to derive several versions of this and then work it out. But we're going to show you what that equation means in a practical sense. So recall that Tupolev crashes 7 times in a million. You might say, well, what would happen if we had a base rate of 2 crashes per million, which is right here, and we call that the base value. So what we have here is the hull loss rate per million flights. Baseline is 2. This is the added value due to fewer hull losses. So at 2, that's our baseline. So we're at 100%. And it turns out that if we get 10 times safer, which is to say we crash 1 time in 10 as much, by golly, that value goes up to 62% more than it was before. Now, it may be the case that some manufacturers may have lost sight of this. But this is telling you that as you go through your safety program, so you do all the stuff in ground test, you do all the structural testing, then you do flight testing, you work your envelope out. It's saying that, if you think it's going to take you an extra year maybe to go from 2 to 0.2, well, it's probably going to be worth it in this field for you to take the extra time to make that plane that much safer. And I would submit that you need to get this message out to upper management to get their buy-in on this. Now, finally, we're going to turn our attention to launchers, launch vehicles. And in support of that, created this database in 2012. And so these are all the launchers built in the West, or actually in the United States, excuse me. We don't have Ariane in here, nor the Chinese, nor the Russians. And you see we've retrieved the price, the total Kn is the force in kilonewtons. That's basically the effective horsepower. We also have the burn time in seconds. That's effectively how long the stack can burn from start to finish. It's roughly equivalent to range, or flexibility term. Each part of the stack has a certain ISP. We're taking the minimum here. This is basically a measure of efficiency. And then success rate. Now the success rate in a launcher, as defined here, is the probability for all the launches that they have getting the payload to the assigned orbit. So you see here we have a pretty wide range at that time for these launchers here. Now you take the correlations of these to price, you see success rate. It's kind of tied for third with the burn time. But most importantly is the efficiency and the total force. So when you combine these terms, you can come up with a pretty slick equation here, explained again in the paper, which basically says that the sustainable price for a launcher is a function of all these things, times the success rate. Now, the success rate is the inverse of the failure rate. So here, the success rate is to a positive power. So if it hits 1, it's 1 to the 1.6 or 1, but anything less than 1, the success rate is going to detract from what you're going to be able to get. So we want to isolate success rate. And when we do that, or before we do that, what we want to do is look at the success rate for some individual launches that were out in the industry here. So Pegasus had been part of Orbital Sciences, then Northrop Grumman now doesn't fly anymore, but you see Pegasus started with a success. This is launches, number of launches here, success rate here. So Pegasus started with a success, had a failures, 2 successes, 2 failures, and then they bounced around. They finally became consistently successful, and they stayed in industry for quite some time. Now compare that to the Lockheed Martin Athena. It had 2 launches, 2 failures and 7 launches. And so when it had the second failure there, so they started out with a failure, success, 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 second failure, it kind of shook up the market. So even though they had 2 more launches committed and they took them, the market gave up on them. Now, a lot of people forgot about SpaceX before they had the Falcon 9, they had the Falcon 1. Well, the Falcon 1 began with 3 failures, and they were all paid launches. So then they had a self-funded one here, number 4. That was a success. And they had another paying flight, but then they quickly pivoted to the Falcon 9 because they figured they weren't going to make a go of this. And then most recently, Virgin Orbit, a Richard Branson company related to Virgin Galactic, Virgin Atlantic, and Virgin everything else. Well, they had their own launcher, kind of was akin to the Pegasus in that it was launched off of a airliner, dropped as a rocket, and then shot up into space. It started out with a failure, had 1 success, and then they instantly went into paying flights. And so they were good on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th one. But when they had the 6th flight, that went belly up, and so did the company. So what does this tell us? Well, what we can see from here is that the market has formed kind of a fuzzy threshold for success. What do I mean by that? Well, somewhere in the 65 to 75% range, if you can't sustain that, and hopefully exceed that, the market will give up on you. So here you see Pegasus was toying around with this, got down to that, and then finally exceeded it, and the market was happy with that. Athena hit the 70+% mark, but then fell below, and then the market gave up on this. SpaceX gave up on themselves when they were down here, and Virgin Orbit also hit this low spot here, and then that put them out of the market. So what do you make of all that then? You say, well, maybe we could figure out the value of added success rate, how that would impact the value of the launcher itself. So not surprisingly, success rates, as that equation implies, have a significant impact on sustainable prices. So if you were running at 80%, you might call this a success multiplier, the value multiplier. You're getting 69% of the total 100% possible if you always ran perfect flights. You're getting 69.7% of 100% success if you're at this level. But if you can improve that by 20%, going from 80% to 96%, well, you get over 1/3 more in retrievable value on your launcher. So how could we apply this to real-world ongoing programs? Well, SpaceX has a real ongoing program. So it's the world's largest launch vehicle. Many of you are aware of it. This thing's got about 50% more thrust than the Delta IV Heavy, and much more than the previous Saturn V rockets that we had. And it's got 2 stages fully reusable, and they're going to be able to put costs up, as we're going to see here, prices rather, far below what my model would predict as being a sustainable price. Now, what does that do for them? Well, when you drop the price, because of the demand curve, you get to sell more vehicles. So if you use the company data, and I did, the company basically gives you what amounts to a complete cost profile here. So Elon Musk said that he spent $2 billion in 2023. He said in 2024, he spent $4 million a day. He plans to finish it in 2025, and he began in 2014. So if you take an ogive curve, and we've got a little tool that actually moves an ogive curve left, right, changes the shape. If you fit that to those points and get the air terms as low as you can, you'll discover that the area under that curve is about 9.3 billion, which is within his estimate for the total development cost. Now, as you may know too, he's had a few explosions lately, so he's got a ways to go. So Mr. Musk has had 8 flights of this vehicle so far, and 4 have gone well and 4 haven't. So in order for him to get up to a 75% threshold, he's going to have to string together a bunch of positive launches. So that's what he's going up against right now. So all programs I submit to you need kind of this kind of profile to work out their viability. What we discovered previously in a previous work environment was that ogive curves that are loaded, more left loaded, you see here the skew is off to the right, it's right skewed. Things that are more left loaded, which is to say they get up to their top price more quickly, well, they do better in the long run than programs that are like this, but Musk is pulling it off anyway. So we know their costs for development here. So you might say, well, what are the recurring costs and revenues? Well, Mr. Musk has said he's going to charge $100 million per launch. We should take him at his word. And what we might want to do here is assume that we have a hypothetical first unit cost here of $50 million. And that's populating this table. It's coming up with an 80% learning curve. That comes up with a certain cumulative cost and a certain cumulative revenue. And you say, well, geez, Doug, we don't want to rely on one of these. We want to have at least a couple. So you can put another one there to bound it. And of course, you can put risk terms around these things to bound it further. So here's one that's looking at it if it's $200 million a piece. If we do the analysis here, the Delta IV Heavy was flying very recently for just shy of $500 million, and this is over 50% more capable. This vehicle is worth $750 million per launch if you want to charge full boat, but if you charge less than that, you're going to get more launches. And so Mr. Musk has worked out this balance between getting the cost way down and going down the demand curve so you can make more money. And that's actually quite brilliant. Now, how do I know he's going to be okay? Or how would you know that he's going to be okay with this? Well, what you could do, and what I did, is you could take all the launchers in the world, and you could take where they were in red here, and plot the quantity on this axis and their price per launch in this axis. We're escalated all this stuff to $2024. Here's the Falcon 9. And the points along this curve here formed a statistically significant demand frontier for 2005 to 2014, right here, to the beginning of 2005 to the end of 2014. And $100 million, there only was market support for about 27 vehicles here. But what's happened since then, Delta IV Heavy went out here. This is not a statistically significant curve. This is the Falcon 9, so I've just drawn a line through these 2 points. But at $100 million, SpaceX could sell 221 of these vehicles in that period at 100 million. Now, they say they've sold more of the Falcon 9, which is cheaper. But that's what this line is implying. What does that let us do then? Well, if we take the data that we had from before, which is the development curve, and then we add in the cost curves and the price curves, we get two different profiles here that lets us figure out the net profit, net present value for the vehicle in blue if the first unit cost was $50 million, or if it's in red at $200 million, this lets you figure out the cost for that. So by creating its own demand, so most of these launches are for Starlink, which is their satellite system. Most of the stuff that Elon is sending up now, something in the order 80% of all his launches are for himself. He's sending up a whole bunch of satellites. So by creating his own demand, he's making a profitable launcher for himself here that he could sell to other people. So what's this all lead to? Well, what's the sum of all this? Well, Starship should be profitable. And that we've seen the safety recently has taken a back seat apparently to value, cost, and demand considerations, or profitability if you're really trying to be cynical about it. And while safety has a cost, it also has a return. So if you make your general aviation plane add a parachute, it decreases the value by about 20%. If you add another engine, you go from about 20% more to 30% more in value. And the Cirrus outsold every one of its competitors for over 20 years. And then in airliners, there's a tremendous return, over 60% if you become 10% or 10x safer. And then in launchers, by becoming 20% more reliable, you've added another third to your value. So I submit to you that it's crucial to figure these things out over time to figure out if you can verify the viability of a program, and that safety should move from the background of the company to the forefront. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your time, and I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
Doug, so as you were giving this, I started thinking about automobiles, and I'm curious, what is the relationship, or what's the value to the customer of greater safety in an automobile? Because automobiles have become a lot safer over time, over the last 20 years. There's a lot more gadgets and gizmos to make it safer, to give drivers more awareness. I just wondered if you'd studied that. I mean, certainly that would seem to fit into this kind of analysis, right?
I have studied that, and there is a return for the value of safety in a car. That's one of the reasons the Tesla sells so well. It had a 5-star rating in all of its various attributes. If you were to go back in time, famously, the Ralph Nader said unsafe at any speed when he was looking at yes, thank you. And then the Hugo, of course, was a terrible car. That also had the same problem.
So what's the tipping point? I mean, at what point does the customer decide safety isn't worth? I mean, you could make things safer and safer and safer, but at some point it starts to degrade the performance of other things you're interested in. So what's that tipping point, I wonder?
That's an excellent question. So what you'd have to do there is actually profile the cost as you add safety. So my hypothetical was that you might add a year to get 10x safer. Is that viable or not? You'd have to see flight test programs that produced good results versus flight test programs that produce bad results. So if I'm Boeing, for example, and I've got my 737-800 and it's leading the field, and then I make the MAX, and maybe you want to blame it on the pilots, but the MAX had its 2 incidents. I might ask myself, well, what was the difference between my flight test program or my ground test program or my entire testing program for the 737 next gens, the 600, 700, 800 series compared to the MAX? I think you'd find the answer would actually appear. And you need to do that between different elements. So for example, the Cessna 172 is a very safe plane, but the Cirrus is safer and is starting to outsell it. So what did Cirrus do that the Cessna didn't? And so Cirrus took themselves about 10 years to get the plane that safe. So I think you'd have to get a variety of cases, back to your point, and be able to plot all those at the same time to get full version of the safety there. Steve, you look like you got a question. Yes.
Yeah, I do. You simulated my thoughts. So, with the air taxis coming out, do you foresee there's no really safety record up to this point, but there's like 200 companies trying to get their product to the market. Do you see them putting a parachute on top?
Yeah, I do. Several of those companies are putting parachutes on the top of their vehicles.
Okay.
For the very reasons that we talked about here. So yes, I do see that happening. Justin.
For the two aircraft scenarios, did you find that the companies have built in that value to their prices, and are the actual prices close to the predicted value?
Yes, that's the reason that equation actually works right there. They've rolled that extra value into their price. So again, if you take the 737-800 and compare it to the Tupolev 204, Tupolev can carry more people. So you remember that value, the volume thing. So that should bump up its price. It goes faster, should bump up the price. And it's got more range, should also bump up the price. But it's selling for about 60% of what the 737 is, because in large measure of that safety issue right there. So yeah, it's actually buried in that equation. And you could probably do some more work to actually extract what it means plane to plane.